Hello everyone and welcome to this podcast, The Balancing Act, a life that changed the way we work, which is part of the Oxford University Unscripted podcast series. My name is Simonetta Manfredi. I'm the Director of Research and Innovation at Oxford Brookes and also Professor of Equality and Diversity Management. And I've got the great pleasure today to be here with Joanna Foster CBE to talk about work-life balance. Joanna has a very distinguished career, but also somewhat eclectic. Is it fair to say, Joanna?
Yeah? Absolutely.
But I think when I looked at your career, there is one constant feature in it, and that you have been great to bring about change, and especially in this area of work-life balance, which is so important for everybody, women, men, and indeed all of us, because it's about the well-being, about we balance different aspects or work with different aspects of our life. I should say also that we are very lucky here that we have your archive. So all your long work in this area and how you actually help to shape policy and practice in the workplace, which have now delivered some new ways of working, is all captured in our archive at Oxford Brookes. So that's for the benefit of our students and whoever really is interested more in this subject. But this topic, which is so important, and recently I've heard some a bit disturbing comments on the press, people challenging, do we really need it, I would say, as in my personal experience, I greatly benefited by flexible working. Where did it all start, Joanna? I know you've been a pioneer. Where does it come from?
Well, thank you for saying those things, and it's wonderful having my archive here. I've got much more room in the drawers at home now.
Good.
Well, I suppose it started because almost everything I've done in my working life has come from what I've been feeling where I am in my life. And I had 2 children, married very young, had 2 children, both of whom were adopted. And we decided, I'd met my husband in France being a student, and we decided that we wanted to live in France, and he was invited to go and work at the INSEAD Business School. And I was invited to go and do some research projects. And so it really was very significant that, because it was full of MBA students, middle management and senior managers. And I was very interested in the MBA students who came with and they were all wives or no partners, right, who'd had to give up their work. And they were looking forward, it being international, that they were going to be training spouse, which indeed I was in following my husband to France, and they were going to have to sort out how to work their family life and their careers, and above all their husbands' careers, because that was what was expected. At the time, there were 2 professors, one called Paul Evans, the other a Spaniard called Fernando Bartolome, and they'd written a wonderful book called Must Success Cost So Much? Which, of course, as you got higher up in the business hierarchy, there were great prices to pay about what was happening with your family and your wife and not seeing your children. And so I started working with, first of all, the women, getting them to think about what skills they had, what they could contribute into the community in Fontainebleau, and how they were going to work out things with their husbands.
So these were the women who were with this student.
They were the training spouses.
The so-called training spouses, yes.
And that got us all thinking a lot about what was going on. Meanwhile, INSEAD didn't have many, very, very few women coming to attend the courses. So there was a lot of research going on like that, needed a lot more role models for the women to see that it was possible. And they were quite difficult to find. Women who were coming to business schools weren't actually trying to balance work and family. They were just keen on climbing. So France was very significant to me. It was wonderful living there. The children had a wonderful time. In France, they closed the schools on Wednesdays, which was wonderful, and all the shops were shut. So there was built-in time to do family things and a great forest to explore. So that was wonderful. And then came the invitation from my husband to go to Carnegie Mellon, to the business school there, to do what he'd done at INSEAD, to put it up the charts really as a business school. So from Paris to Pittsburgh, which I can tell you was quite a culture change.
I imagine,
Children were thrilled. They didn't have to go on learning about French rivers at 11:15 in the morning. My husband had a wonderful job. I didn't even have a green card. And I'd been there when I was 21 and had a pretty wonderful time. So this was not a good moment. However, very soon after we arrived, other than being slightly overawed by the fact that most people seem to have 3 PhDs, we were invited to a supper party, which I felt immediately at home with. The family had adopted children, and there was a man there who ran the medical school. And he said, "What have you done with your life, Mrs. Foster?" So I felt slightly worried about that. So I told him what I'd done, which ranged from working in politics with prime ministers to cleaning out lavatories in a French chateau to start a bilingual school in France. He was clearly rather surprised by that. And the next morning, I went to his office and he said, "Well, I'd like you to help do some research into stress in women." And that was the beginning of my American part, because Pittsburgh had the steel industry, which was going down.
Right, I see.
And he was getting in his secret doors the CEOs who were very stressed. They didn't say that. They said, "My teams are stressed." Their wives were coming in the middle doors, and their wicked teenage children who were feeling very stressed were coming in the bottom. So we started doing stress management. I used to choose amongst my colleagues somebody who looked the least like Woody Allen, i.e. the absolutely standard shrink. And I always remember my first stress management course was wonderful. I thought, they're listening. They mind about stress. They mind about their employees. But actually, they dislike my English accent.
But it's interesting that you talk about the stress management there, because I've just said in my introduction, you know, how important this is, work-life balance also to our well-being. And now over the last few years, there has been a lot of awareness about well-being in the workplace. How do we maintain the well-being, how we promote it? So it's interesting now that from what you're telling me, it's concern about the well-being, it's concern about the stress, somehow possibly started all this conversation?
Yes, stress absolutely did, because people hadn't really divided up what was causing stress. And of course, the pressures of not seeing your family, like all those French undergraduates and the steel managers, was enormous. And they were burning out, and it was affecting their mental health, and there was no well-being to speak of. But America was actually charging ahead with equal opportunities, and there was the Boston College was running a work-life unit, very small. And so my lovely boss, who'd given me the job, the top of that, he said, "Right, shall we translate it into getting it wider? We understand what's causing people stress." So we started doing some pilot work-life programs. And at that point, the phone call came from my husband to come back to Oxford to do at Templeton, which was pre-Said, the same sort of things he'd done in the previous things. So I was delighted to come back to Oxford, and we wanted to come before our children turned into total Americans as teenagers. And it was at that point I'd rung my old boss at the Industrial Society, a wonderful old institution which is about developing people. And I said to my boss, John Garnett, an extraordinary, the best orator I've ever heard, I said, "I would like to do stress management and work-life balance." He said, "You mustn't do stress management. People will think they're stressed." He was definitely old school. But I went in to manage what was then called the PEPL unit, which was about developing women's development and management and leadership. And I had a small, wonderful team, and we started working with companies.
Just to give an idea to our listener, what time are we? You're back in Oxford
I'm back in Oxford, but working in London.
In London.
And the context...
The year, which years are we talking about?
This was the late 80s.
The late 80s,
And in the context and the culture still in Britain was that men were definitely the breadwinners, and women would have part-time jobs, and there wasn't much happening. However, one of the key issues that happened was around Britain going into the European Union. Because they felt very strongly about equal opportunities. And so there were lots of signs going on that people had to change. And so they began to say, well, we are an equal opportunities employer. which of course was to attract people to them. They were noticing that women were coming out with better results from many, many of the universities. There was a skill shortage, and they realized that they needed women's skills as well as men's skills.
Yes, yeah.
And they realized that if they were going to be successful, they had to adapt to what women needed.
Okay.
So we did lots of work helping them change the rhetoric.
To change the discourse. So a lot of this came from the European Union, because as you said before,
it was one of the big tools.
Yes.
And some of the stuff which was going on in America.
Yeah.
And the marketplace.
Yeah.
And actually women themselves were changing. The community was changing. Altogether, there were lots of pointers which pointed in the direction of equal opportunities. Yes.
I remember, as you're speaking, I remember remember seeing some of those newsletter bulletins coming from the European Union, some also declaring various comments that were made, and there was one which was quite progressive in saying perhaps we also need to learn from the way women, are combining our work with other aspects of our life. So I think now you make me think back to those comments that I read.
Our membership was tremendously key. There was equal pay directive because pay was very unequal still then.
Yeah.
And we had the Equal Pay Act, which actually we didn't. Well, fast forward, it took 10 years to take a successful case of equal pay. But the EU law introduced enhanced protection for families and established the right for parental leave, which of course we didn't take up for a long time, and gradually helped to strengthen the whole culture for better relationships between families and work. So it was tremendously key. However, the government and business was very slow to adapt. But the market played an important role, which was, thank goodness.
So would you say that in America and the European Union level, somehow this discourse about the importance of combining work with family is almost starting in parallel, or did it start first in the United States? That's what I'm trying to establish. Where did it, or it started in both places, perhaps?
Both of us, of course, in the States, the race issues and their legislation, and of course with us, all the race relations.
Yes.
So people were understanding about discrimination in a big way.
Yeah.
And there were beginning to be cases taken and tribunals taken, and companies wanted to preserve their looking good. The competition was very, very key. So their rhetoric was big, and it was, the banks, public sector led the way.
Yes.
I don't know exactly when education started taking a point about it. I remember on the board here at Oxford Brookes, we didn't talk about it high up on the agenda.
Yeah, of course, because you were a member of the Board of Governors.
Very early
Brookes,
on.
Yes, and also we were very lucky to have you, because having you on that board, it meant that you were able to champion some of these initiatives.
It was a wonderful board. We had to meet in Maxwell's bedroom, which was all pink and frilly because of the listed,
yes,
which seemed rather inappropriate, but there we go.
Yeah.
So we did programs for employers, for trade unions, who were very important in the public sector, education, and terribly important for women themselves, who were beginning to get themselves into networks.
Right.
And they were beginning to discuss how life was.
Yes.
Not enough money, no, how on earth did one do any of the balancing? So I think the networks were very key, and a gradual realization that the wider pool of skill, the more prosperous and better business was going to be, and work was going to be. And they realized that family-friendly practices were absolutely part of that. So the business case became
starting
the
to take shape.
Key things.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
And some of the, there were some real key strategies that we used with the businesses and the employers. Women's own aspiration, and they were beginning to get much more assertive. There were plenty of assertiveness courses for women these days, but women were beginning to ask. The journalists, there were a lot of very good journalists, and Polly Toynbee, for instance, is still around, minded enormously about this because they were experiencing the same thing.
Firsthand,
So we had really wonderful, wonderful media coverage.
Yeah.
And yes, the competition amongst the company played a lot. I just want to give you some examples. The sort of things we did to encourage women. We ran a series of courses with Cosmopolitan magazine. Now, my mother thought it was all going to be about sex, but actually it was about, where are you, how are you going to climb the ladder?
Yeah.
And we needed 2 role models. So I got Anita Bruckner from The Body Shop and Prue Leith, who both of whom had young children and been successful in their early businesses, so that the women on the courses could look up and say it's possible.
Yes.
We had hundreds of women from the insurance industry, which told us the insurance industry wasn't doing anything. We weren't doing any of our courses with the employers. So the next key thing was to tackle the insurance industry. And my boss, who I mentioned, organised with the head of the Prudential that I should go for lunch there. And I knew before we sat down to the main course, I had to find in the room who was the man who was going to be sensitive to these issues, because I wanted somebody to be the role model for the other all-male heads of insurance. And I found the wonderful Joe Palmer, head of Legal and General. His wife had just gone to the Open University, and he had 2 daughters. And that, I have to say, I've used as a strategy all my life to around these issues. And he started something called Women in Insurance, and the insurance industry, and in particular Legal and General, became outstanding. And of course, all the other companies said, can't let them get away with it.
Of course, because then it's a competitive spirit then starts.
And yes, exactly that. It was competition. So all of that was going on, and it was tremendously exciting because people wanted it to happen for business reasons and women for their own aspirational reasons. And it just went with the culture of what was happening in the country. Women were emerging more and more
in the workplace.
Employers were beginning to understand there was some good people out there.
Yes, yes. And it's interesting that you say about this, that he had daughters, because I found in some of the research that I did by looking at women's role in the workplace, leadership, etc., the men who have daughters, they seem to become quite receptive because they want because they want their daughters to succeed.
Yes,
they don't like the idea,
and they were very proud of having clever daughters.
Very proud of their daughters. They're very clever daughters. They don't want them to then not having to be able to fulfill their aspirations. So I think that they can be very good allies, can't they? Yeah. Joanna, that has been absolutely fascinating, and I really find it very interesting to understand, because when I started doing some work in some research on work-life balance, I think it was already in full swing, but really to gain this insight, where they all come from and what were the motivating factors and the drives that start put this conversation on the table. This is fantastic. I think perhaps this is the end of our first podcast, and thank you very much to our listener for listening. I hope you enjoyed this conversation. And if you want to find out more of what happened next, please join us for our second podcast.